Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, CTTI's Comprehensive Guide to Mobile Technologies in Clinical Trials, presented by Amazon Web Services. I'm Lita Sands, the Worldwide Head of Life Sciences for AWS, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Just a few technical notes before we begin. If you'd like to download the slide deck, please click the Resources List button at the bottom of your screen. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. And we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button on the left side of your screen. So in my role, I work with pharmaceutical, biotech, medical devices, and CROs to help accelerate transformation in the industry. I was honored to be a part of the CTTI initiative to develop and disseminate these comprehensive guidelines for the use of mobile technologies in clinical trials. Not only will these help us embrace the growing use of mobile technologies by consumers to help achieve health and wellness goals, but they will also enable us to make the clinical trial experience much more patient-centric, enabling greater inclusion of patients into trials and providing us with insights into disease states that we've never had before. AWS founded our healthcare and life sciences vertical almost 5 years ago now. And we've been in the unique position of understanding the needs of healthcare providers and payers and translating those needs to our customers in life sciences so they can play a stronger role in this rapidly evolving healthcare system. Clinical trials is an important area for us. We believe that while we are living in a golden age of drug discovery and innovation, the tools that researchers have access to were designed for a very different era. Technologies such as cloud computing, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, and machine learning can help us redesign the process so we can ensure that these new, novel medications reach patients as quickly and as safely as possible. What's exciting is that we're seeing innovation happening along the entire clinical trial process, with tools emerging to help develop smarter protocols, to help data to be exchanged with healthcare providers to accelerate recruiting, and to enable use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to eliminate the commodity, low-value tasks of repetitive data entry, reduce errors, and provide actionable insights. With these guidelines, we believe we have the first roadmap to helping researchers around the world clearly understand when and how to use mobile technologies in clinical trials, demystifying everything from selection of the devices, access and utilization of the data, engagement of patients, and evaluation of the results. So it's my honor today to introduce 3 members of the group who will help us understand these guidelines from the perspective of patients, researchers, and regulatory bodies. Dr. Ray Dorsey is the David M. Levy Professor of Neurology and Director of the Center for Health and Technology at the University of Rochester. Through creative use of technology, he and his colleagues seek to enable anyone, anywhere to receive care, participate in research, and benefit from therapeutic advances. Linda Ritchie started her career in the FDA in 2005 and has had several roles, including scientific reviewer and branch chief within the Division of Cardiovascular Devices. Currently, Ms. Ritchie is the Associate Director for Digital Health within the Office of Device Evaluation. Abby Bronson is the Senior Vice President of Research Strategy at Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, a patient advocacy organization dedicated to improving the lives of those with Duchenne. Previously, she was the Director of Operation at the CTSA program at the NIH. Okay, now let's begin. Ray, over to you.
Thank you, Lita. So the last decade has seen an exponential increase in the use of digital tools to measure health. And just looking at the number of published studies of accelerometers over the last 60 or 70 years, you can see that this is really a phenomenon of the last 10 years. And the group at CTTI recently published a systematic review of mobile technologies in the new journal, Digital Biomarkers. And that work, they identified 88 studies that evaluated mobile technologies to measure health. And the most common therapeutic areas for evaluation were in cardiology, diabetes, and sleep, which accounted for about half the studies. But you can see about 10 different therapeutic areas ranging from cancer to arthritis to nutrition were subjected to evaluation. And importantly, 1/4 of these 88 studies were evaluating mobile technologies in the context of an interventional trial. In my field of neurology, you've seen a similar exponential increase in the evaluation of smartphones and wearable sensors to evaluate neurological disorders. And just a month ago, Roche Pharmaceuticals published the use of a smartphone as an exploratory outcome measure in a phase 1 clinical trial. And in that study, Roche used a smartphone to measure features of Parkinson's disease such as gait, voice, and balance, and showed that this was feasible, that the least adherent participants used the smartphone on 40% of the days that were requested, and have now advanced the smartphone into an ongoing phase 2 clinical trial. Given the rapid interest in the use of mobile technologies, CTTI organized a multi-stakeholder process to provide guidance on the use of mobile technologies in clinical trials. CTTI, or the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, is the brainchild of the cardiologist and former FDA Commissioner Dr. Robert Califf when he was at Duke University, and is a public-private partnership between the Duke University and the FDA, and its mission is to develop and drive adoption of practices that will increase the quality and efficiency of clinical trials. To that end, CTTI's efforts are focused broadly on increasing the quality and efficiency of trials through multiple different efforts, and the mobile clinical trials effort is just one example. The purpose of the Mobile Clinical Trials Program was to develop evidence-based recommendations that affect the widespread adoption and use of mobile technology in clinical trials for regulatory submission. And it had 4 pillars that were part of it. 1, using mobile measures to develop novel or new endpoints for clinical studies. 2, to focus on data issues around the use of mobile technologies. 3, to engage stakeholders in the process. And 4, to begin thinking about decentralization of clinical trials. True to their focus on a multi-stakeholder process, the project team for this effort included representations from patients or the research participants, technology firms, pharmaceutical firms, academic researchers, and the government, especially FDA and NIH. So why do we need the mobile technologies? And the short answer is because in many disease areas, the current measures are rater-dependent, subjective, episodic, and conducted only in clinic. And what we really need are participant-centered measures that are objective, frequent, and real-world. In my field of Parkinson's disease, the way we rate Parkinson's right now is we have individuals tap their thumb and index finger as big and fast as they can 10 times. And experts like me rate that on a categorical scale that goes from 0 to 4. Obviously, we have digital tools that can measure that objectively, precisely, and in wide range of settings outside the clinic. Not surprisingly, our current understanding of many conditions is very limited to what we see in the clinic, when in reality participants have their diseases 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we currently have very limited means of measuring the 99.9% of time research participants are not in the clinic. And just in a simple example is, think about how blood glucose measurements have transformed the care and research for individuals with diabetes. We wouldn't dose individuals insulin for the next 3 months based on a single recording done in clinic. The recommendations that CTTI came up with through the mobile clinical trials effort are focused on 5 areas. 1, on the selection of the mobile technology, what digital tools should be used to measure the outcomes that are desired. 2, the data collection, analysis, and interpretation. 3, data management. 4, protocol design and execution. And 5, FDA submission and inspection. On the balance of the call, Linda Ritchie is going to talk to us about the selection of mobile technologies. Abby Bronson is going to discuss participant engagement as a prerequisite for success. I'm going to return briefly to highlight some additional resources available to you, and then Lita's going to lead us through a discussion and question and answer session. I am now delighted to introduce Linda Ritchie from the FDA.
Thanks, Ray. Good afternoon. I would like to share with you the CTTI recommendations regarding mobile technology selection. Before we get started, I want to make sure that we are all on the same page with regards to the definition of mobile technology in this context. The Mobile Clinical Trials Mobile Technology Team has defined mobile technologies as mobile applications and other wearables, ingestibles, implantables, and portable technologies containing sensors for the remote capture of outcomes data. With this in mind, let's get started. There are 5 recommendations regarding how to select an appropriate mobile technology as shown on this slide. The first recommendation is to know what you want to measure before selecting your mobile technology. Select your tool based on what you want to measure rather than selecting what you want to measure based on your tool. By identifying what you want to measure prior to selecting a tool, the technology selected can be chosen due to its ability to perform the measurement in the best way possible for your study based on your limitations. This ties very closely to the second recommendation, which is that the mobile technology selection should be specification-driven and collaborative. The collaboration here involves both the technology company and patients. Specifically, the selection should be driven by the technical performance the study needs and the preference of study participants. This slide illustrates the specifications for sponsors to consider. The technical performance specifications are divided into measurement performance and mobile technology communication and data transfer. With regards to measurement performance, specifications such as accuracy, precision, sampling frequency, resolution, data processing, and metadata should be considered. It's also important to keep in mind that the measurement chosen should inform the specifications. The communications and data transfer specifications considerations include app pairing and transfer to data gathering platforms. Data management specifications generally include Part 11 and specific data access for things such as mobile technology manufacturer access to study data, sponsor access to study data, and third-party access to study data. We will be discussing this more on the next slide. Study participant safety is paramount, and appropriate specifications should be developed for this. The human factor specification should be informed by the participant population. Specifications to consider include acceptability, tolerability, and usability. Operational specifications may include failure rate, battery life, and firmware performance. And lastly, non-operational specifications can include cost and customer service. Returning back to data access, this one may not be as obvious as some of the other items. When using mobile technology, it is important to remember that the technology manufacturer themselves may not provide all of the data that is collected by that technology. To this end, and prior to selecting a technology, it is important to consider, 1, whether you will have access to the raw data that's generated by the mobile technology and whether you need it. 2, what levels of the process data are accessible by the technology, and again, what is needed for your study. 3, if the algorithm used to process the data is accessible. And 4, the format of the data. So in summary, when determining what is needed for a study with regards to data access, consider how the data generated by the mobile technology will be accessed and used by the manufacturer, and also what data will be provided to you as the trial sponsor. The city recommendation is to ensure that the access to data meets your needs prior to contracting an electronic service vendor. Moving on to the next recommendation, City recommends that a technology's regulatory status not be the sole driver in sponsors' decisions about which mobile technology to use. In other words, for use within a clinical trial, a mobile technology does not typically need to be cleared or approved as a medical device. Many mobile technologies are considered consumer products and are still very useful as data collection tools in clinical investigations. The next recommendation is with regards to verification and validation. The appropriateness of the selected mobile technology should be justified through verification and validation processes. Let's explore this a bit more. Verification in this context refers to the assessment of accuracy, precision, consistency over time, uniformity across mobile technologies, and potentially user environmental conditions. This is really an engineering assessment. Verification should demonstrate a lack of errors for the firmware that processes the sensor data. The test criteria that is often used is a physical bench standard. Typical variances in the sensor measurements are less than 1%, and this information is typically provided by the technology manufacturer themselves. In contrast, validation assures that the process data are suitable for the intended use and patient population in a trial. Validation is really a biological assessment, the assessment of the accuracy and precision of the biological endpoints that are derived from the sensor data. This is usually measured against an independent standard. Unlike verification, variances in endpoint measurements can be very large, but still can be useful, and this ends up being a statistical question. Validation can be provided by the device manufacturer themselves, an independent study by a user, or a new study for a specific patient population. Ultimately, the study sponsor is responsible for ensuring that the chosen measures are appropriate for use in a trial. At this point, let's walk through this table as an example. The raw data is the output from a physical sensor. The process data is the output from mobile technology firmware, and the outcome assessment is the output from the analysis algorithm. As has been previously discussed, the raw data and the process data are verified, and the outcome assessment is validated. In walking through the examples, let's start with accelerometry. The raw data for accelerometry is the acceleration itself. The process data is the activity counts, whereas the outcome assessment could be either the time spent active or the time spent sleeping. Another example is ECG. The raw data is the electrical potential. The process data is the heart rate. And the outcome assessment is the heart rate variability. Lastly, the fifth recommendation is that feasibility studies conducted before full implementation in a large study reduce risk. These studies can help to address unanticipated challenges associated with the integration of the technology in a clinical trial. For additional information on these recommendations, I encourage you to review the resources listed here. Thank you for your attention. Now I would like to turn the presentation over to Abby Bronson.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Linda. To start, I'd like to thank the organizers for hosting this webinar and this important topic, and it's a pleasure to be here. So we just heard about many of the technological factors to consider when choosing a mobile technology, but all the best decisions can be made in vain if the patient voice isn't appropriately incorporated into the process, as they're the ones that have to embrace the technology and the data it produces. I'm here today to talk about how best to harness the patient voice and the role of patient engagement in developing a mobile technology, and some of the key things to consider throughout the process. Just like with any clinical trial, the patient's voice should be represented at every stage throughout the trial. Patients are the experts on their disease and can provide a unique perspective on living with the disease and what matters to them. This engagement will make them feel like an active decision maker. They will better understand the research question, and thus recruitment and retention will be improved and the data gathered will be of higher quality. Engagement should take place from the very beginning of trial design and hopefully will be iterative and should continue through dissemination of trial results, making adoption of the technology more efficient. Participant engagement can take many forms, from formal qualitative research and focus groups upfront, to feasibility testing, as we heard just previously, to partnering with patient advocacy organizations such as Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy and developing citizen scientists. I'm sure some of you who are listening to this, you're hearing me say all this, oh, this is going to take time, it's going to slow things down and cost more money. But from experience, gaining this valuable patient input upfront will save time over the long haul. One of the hot topics that's arisen during the development of these guidelines has to do with sharing data generated from the trial back to the patient. And being a patient advocate, we are very much in support of this notion. We are very involved in patient-focused drug development, and I see data sharing back to patients as PFDD coming full circle. But mobile technology presents the unique situation where data sharing can happen in real time. So the first consideration is safety to the participants. Just like in any clinical trial, participant safety is the #1 priority, so any data sharing in real time has to be examined in this context. The question is, might any data readouts in real time cause harm? Could they be misinterpreted by the patient, not be able to be managed by the patient? Will they understand what the readouts mean? Providing real-time data back can be very motivating to the participants and encourage compliance, but it needs to be balanced with what and how much can be provided. The second thing to consider is whether real-time data sharing could influence whatever outcome you're measuring and bias study results. If there's a reasonable chance that bias could be introduced, in our experience, participants would rather wait to receive the results post-trial if that is what it takes to maximize the possibility that the results won't be confounded. I think we sometimes forget what a huge burden being in a trial is. Travel time to the sites, assessment time, invasive procedures, emotional toll on the family and caregivers, wondering if you're on active or placebo, was it the right decision to be in this trial in the first place? This all weighs heavily on the patients' and families' minds. In our Duchenne community, we've had more trial failures than successes, and each time the patient community is devastated and heartbroken to receive the news. But more importantly, they want answers and accountability. They want to know why the trial failed. The last thing they want is to have gone through a trial and have it be all for naught because there was a technical design issue, and this might include biased results from sharing data in real time. They would have rather waited and have valid trial results. So if there's a question about that, I would you should wait and not share all data back real time. I think the most important part of this slide is the last bullet point. Ask your patients if they want results. Ask them what types of data they would like to receive and when, and ratchet back if what they want is not possible or might bias results. And as a bare minimum, offer to review summarized data at the end of the trial and give the overall results, whether negative or positive. All of this communication, even spelling it out in the informed consent, are so important for patient communities and will help all aspects of executing a trial. And there's no such thing as one-size-fits-all mobile technology trial design. And each trial will take hearing the patient's voice and deciding what makes sense in terms of providing data back while ensuring the integrity of the study data and the safety of the participants. To reinforce this, this slide shows the results of a study that survey did. And the pie chart on the right shows that the results of the question, how important sharing real-time data generated by mobile technology is to patients. And as you can see, 80% of respondents feel it's very important or important to see their data shared back. We asked another question about frequency, and most would prefer to see it weekly if possible. And this confirms data we have gathered from our Duchenne community during our last annual conference, where we did live polling with over 400 families who were in attendance. And we asked a question on factors that would most influence the family to join a trial with wearable sensors, as we termed it. Knowing that they were going to receive data back real time to assess their child's activity level was one of the most motivating reasons for them to participate in a wearables trial, along with contributing to Duchenne natural history research and being able to participate in other interventional trials at the same time. But this need and this idea of sharing data back, it does not take away from ensuring that it does not compromise the integrity of the trial and the safety of the participants. To help make this decision about determining if sharing data in real time will impact trial integrity, CITI created a decision tool to help evaluate whether outcomes data collected should be shared with study participants in real time via the mobile technology. It was designed to be used by sponsors and trial designers in partnership with patients. And I think this could be a great part of the dialogue between patients and those running the trial to enhance communications about the trial. As you walk through it, you will see where patient input could greatly enhance the decision making. The questions are organized hierarchically and logically walk you through the impact the real-time outcomes could have on the safety, quality, and feasibility of a trial. However, this tool is not intended to be applicable to every trial, nor to be all-inclusive. For instance, CITI recognizes that relative ranking of questions may vary according to the nature of the study and recommends that users freely adapt this tool to best meet their needs. For more information or other things to consider related to sharing data in real time, please see the recommendations that CITI put together, section 4.1, and there's a lot more information. Another hot topic that I thought may underscore the importance of participant engagement is data use, and we all know that privacy is an important topic to consider. Patients cannot fully provide informed consent unless they know how their data will be used, and this includes real-time data. We heard from our previous speaker about understanding how a manufacturer will handle, use, and store the data is critical on deciding on a technology and platform. Equally as important is informing patients of how their data will be stored, accessed, and by whom. And sponsors need to understand if there are any limits on how their data might be accessed and used. Again, patients are the experts here and their experience counts. This all needs to be laid out in any third-party agreements and included in the informed consent. I think it really comes down to trust. If there is transparency upfront in how data will be used and accessed, and it is captured in all the agreements, most patients are willing to share. In the same CITI survey that they published in 2017, patients were asked how worried they would be if others besides the research team had access to their data. More than 50% say they were not worried, with another third being only a little worried. I would encourage everyone to look at the case study called Using Remote Smartphone-Based Data Collection to Broadly Share Health Insights, which found that of 9,000 participants that enrolled in the first 6 months of a study, more than 75% opted to broadly share their study data. This has been our experience in the Duchenne community as well. Most families and participants, if engaged early and included in the decision-making process, are supportive of sharing their data for research purposes and understand that we're on the edge of a fundamental change in how we collect outcomes, and that they could be part of making data collection through mobile technology a reality, and that this could be a more effective way of conducting clinical trials. And I also think they're very open to data sharing because of the seriousness of their disease and the difficulty in finding cures. Most of them feel a real sense of urgency. Lastly, in terms of collecting quality data, CITI developed a table that outlines recommended strategies for optimizing data quality using mobile devices. And I want to highlight several that I think really lend themselves to patient engagement. And the first is formulating the research questions. Patients need to be engaged from the very beginning in developing research questions, because if they don't feel it's relevant, they're not going to participate. And the research question, this really relates back to deciding what novel endpoint, the novel outcome that you're going to be measuring with the device. Secondly is the selection of the mobile technology. This is where the needs and capabilities of the study population need to be included. They're the experts and know what will work and won't. For instance, I was just on a call where a sponsor, in terms of choice of device, had not considered whether it needed to be waterproof or not. They had not considered whether the patient would swim, would they get wet, would they need to take the device off to do so, and if so, how much data would be missing if they did. It is these types of situations that, if overlooked, can have a big impact on compliance and data quality. Third is feasibility testing of the protocol. To avoid any unanticipated issues related to data collection as outlined in the protocol, it's recommended that a pilot test of the protocol be done, so that things like data attribution errors, data variability, and sources of missing data can be uncovered and remedied before the actual trial starts, ensuring quality data. And of course, this needs to be done with the actual users. The URL in this slide contains the complete table of recommended strategies for optimizing data quality, and it's a great resource. So in summary, we're in an exciting time, and I'm very optimistic about how mobile technologies can change how we collect outcomes in clinical trials, and I'm really looking forward to see where we are in the next 5 to 10 years. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Ray.
Thank you very much, Abby. When thinking about applying these recommendations, we should just remember that the recommendations should be applied consistent with the same principles of good clinical practice, with adherence to scientific principles, data quality, and participant engagement. And a good analogy for the use of mobile technologies is just to think about how imaging has been incorporated in clinical trials over the last 25 years. And many of the same issues, especially around data collection, data management, protocol design, and FDA submission and inspection, and selection of the imaging modality would apply to mobile technologies as well. And the disruption that's been enabled by these mobile technologies is not only changing clinical trials, it's changing clinical care. And many of the research studies that are being done will quickly, I think, find their way into affecting the way we care for patients. So just 3 studies that are worth noting is one highlighted here is a collaboration between Verily, Stanford, and Duke to collect data from 10,000 participants, including clinical, imaging, and self-reported data, as well as data from sensors that can assess sleep and activity. A second study is the Apple Heart Study, which is another ongoing study using the Apple Watch to identify individuals with occult atrial fibrillation who can then be connected to a clinician over video conferencing over their watch and then be guided as to whether cardiology follow-up is necessary. And finally, the NIH is sponsoring the All of Us study, which is seeking to gather health data on 1 million research participants through various modalities, including mobile technologies. All of these point to the immense ability to drive scale in clinical studies that previously was really inconceivable, and all of them also highlight the potential that when these technologies are used in clinical trials, they will likely migrate their way into use into clinical care. So what can you do next? You can access the recommendations and resources, including many that Abby and Linda highlighted earlier. And if you have any questions, you can contact Citi and their outstanding project manager, Jennifer Goldsack, who is well equipped to answer any questions that you have and does so in a very responsive and friendly and British way. And the general email for Citi is provided there. With that, I'll turn it over to Lita to handle the questions and answers.
Great. Thank you so much, Ray. Okay, so let's move on to the Q&A section now. There's still time to submit your questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we have a lot of great questions already, so we're going to try to get to as many as possible. So our first question is for Abby. Abby, you shared that it may not always be appropriate to share outcomes data in real time with study participants. How can we promote patient engagement and acceptance of the technology in these cases?
That's a great question. So I'm assuming, first of all, that the reason you wouldn't want to share the outcomes back real time is for a safety concern or for a possible, it could influence study behavior and then bias the results. So first of all, there's other things that you could really do before the trial even starts. And we talked a little bit about the research question and getting patients involved up front, maybe doing a focus group on developing the outcome and the research question. So that is some patient engagement you could do right there. And then, working with them through the informed consent process and discussing or making clear that at the end, what data you will provide at the end of the trial and why you're not providing it during the trial. Those are a couple things you could do before and after. And there might be data that you could provide back to the participant during the trial that does not interfere with behavior or provide a safety concern. So we've discussed things like there could be some compliance data or your 45% way through the trial data, just encouragement data or pats on the back, good job. That you'd have to assess it with the patients, of course, but that type of data might be able to be provided back to the patient during the trial. So those are just some ideas. Anybody else?
And of course, Ray, as you were mentioning, as over time mobile devices become more of the standard of care, we can look then to implement patient feedback as appropriate to help patients get to better outcomes faster.
Yes, and again, the analogy thinking about blood glucose levels, and probably initially that data wasn't initially shared with research participants and then became more and more mainstream, and now patients control that and have self-management of their own conditions.
Excellent, thank you. This next question I'll ask Linda to start us off. For regulatory purposes, how can it be verified that mobile devices that were used to collect data were used only by the study participants? And Linda, after you answer that, Ray, I'm going to turn that to you to go a little bit deeper into the two-phase approach that CTTI recommends. But first, let's start out with the first part of that question. Linda?
Thank you. First, it's important to think about how you're selecting your device and make sure that the device that you're selecting allows for the appropriate controls that you would need in order to assess that the data that you are getting is from the participant that you expect. So there are digital tools that are available through some kind of a login mechanism or some other authentication principles that would allow you to basically trust the data that you are getting being from the person that you think it's from. So that's certainly a way to start, and again, it's starting with the selection of your tool and making sure that the tool that you pick allows you to measure what you want to measure in the way that you want to measure it.
Great. And Ray, can you address the two-phase approach CTTI recommends?
Sure. So CTTI recommends two phases. One is a thoughtful design that promotes compliance, and the second is authentication through the technology, as Linda referenced. So I can give you a couple examples. So we did a study with a smartphone for measuring Parkinson's disease, and it turns out that either a test of your gait or your voice or just finger tapping, you leave a digital fingerprint. So I'm 6'5", and so my gait is going to look a lot different than somebody who isn't 6'5", and so I might have longer fingers than somebody who is shorter. In addition, it's also worth remembering that there are substantial shortcomings to authentication with our current measures. So for example, participant diaries. There's little assurance that the people who are completing those diaries are, one, necessarily the research participant, and two, when and where they're being conducted. And our digital tools allow, time and date stamping, and you can have authentication such as passwords that can be used to determine that the person, or increase the likelihood that the person completing those outcome measures is indeed the research participant.
Excellent, thank you. And Ray, I found the paper that you shared earlier about the study that Roche did this year. One of the things that was interesting is how the digital capture had greater sensitivity than the paper-based tools in classifying some of those patients' progression on a certain disease scale. Maybe you could just comment briefly, do you think that these technologies will give us greater insights into disease states going forward?
Yeah, I would just point out again with glucose, we didn't even know about nocturnal hypo and hyperglycemia until we bothered to measure blood glucoses at night. We didn't know much about sleep disorders until we bothered to observe people sleeping. We didn't know about blood pressure variability until we started measuring blood pressure frequently. And these tools are going to give us an enormous window into what happens in the 99.9% of the time that people aren't in clinic, and that our assessments done in clinic are done at arbitrary times in artificial environments, and that these digital tools can give us real-world assessments on how people are functioning.
Thank you. Linda, in your slides you mentioned that you shouldn't have to worry about the mobile device being validated. Could you expand on that? Will study designers need to use medical grade devices?
Thank you. Yes, if I said that, I think it was a little bit out of context, perhaps. Certainly the sensors and the processing and absolutely the outcome measure itself all need to be validated. We were talking about verification versus validation. We were talking about, in this context, the verification is looking at the accuracy of the sensor data itself, while the outcome measurement was being validated to make sure it's the right use in the tool, or excuse me, the right use for the study. And no, none of these need to be medical grade per se. They need to be the right tool for the study. Clinical studies can use devices that help them to measure outcomes without those tools being cleared or approved as medical devices themselves. But that doesn't mean that the outcome that's being measured to support the clinical trial should not be validated and demonstrated to support the overall use in the clinical trial. So when we were talking about verification, we were talking about the accuracy of the measurements themselves, and in validation, we are talking about the accuracy of the utility of the outcome assessment itself. I hope that makes more sense.
Thank you for clarifying that. Good. Abby, what kind of support do you need to give patients when you provide them with mobile technologies?
Well, first of all, I think right off the bat, is it a pediatric population or an adult population? Because that makes a difference. But upfront training, I think that's really important, including webinars and having really good support, 800 numbers and customer service that are available at really a very, not like at a narrow time frame, but accessible. I think just with the upfront training and then having a good customer service support team available, that's a good start.
Excellent, thank you. Ray, how have you? Yeah, go ahead, Ray.
So I agree completely with the points just provided. We train participants at the site. We provide online videos for participants. We try to provide not quite 24/7 access, but we provide a dedicated telephone line for participants to contact. Sometimes we take that activity off the site, so the site coordinators don't necessarily have to worry about all the details of the technology, and that can be a centralized process. We also have email and FAQs on the website along with videos to help participants. All that said, still sometimes people run into difficulties, but those are some of the things that we've used.
Okay, great. And Ray, another question for you. what is the thought around using mobile technologies for studies in populations where there's limited access to the internet?
Yeah, so I don't have a great answer here, but the digital divide, the differential access to the internet and mobile technologies based on social, geographic, and economic factors is a huge issue and can be really a huge issue depending on the disease or patient population that one is studying. We try as much as possible to give people devices that will work independent of where they are, and sometimes people have given Wi-Fi routers into people's homes to facilitate use of it. I'm going to be interested in hear what others have to say as well. We've largely been able to engage just about everyone, but if you look at the people who've been participating in many of our observational studies, they clearly don't represent the general population. They tend to be far more educated than the general population, far more white than the general population, and far more familiar with the internet than the general population.
Okay, so that's an important point to think about when you think about the selection for trials. And Linda, is there anything that you'd add to that?
Yeah, I just to echo, Ray's thoughts. It's important to think about ways to engage those patients in trials as well. So when you're thinking about, what measure you're going to use the tool for, or how you're going to use your mobile technology, thinking about what can be stored with the technology and downloaded at a later point. What has to be done in real time such that a connection is always necessary. And just thinking through, are there ways to use the technology to make sure that you are engaging people in these more remote sites.
Thank you. And Abby, I'm curious what your perspective is on how we reach patients who are perhaps in these areas without access.
Yeah, and it's a question that we've pondered not only in the context of doing a mobile technology study, but just getting them into the clinic. I mean, that's the age-old question: how do you reach the underserved? In the very sort of preliminary workings that we're doing with mobile device studies in our patient population, we're recruiting, or we plan to recruit through our Duchenne registry. So that is an online resource to begin with. So we're kind of by default already starting with a population that is internet literate, so to speak. So, but I agree with what everyone else has said. It's really important to try to think of ways that we could engage these patients even when they don't have internet access.
Great, thank you. So this next question is for Ray. Usability matters for the patient population. What if one of the subpopulations has better usability with one device and another subpopulation has better usability with a different device but collecting the same data? What are the considerations for this scenario?
I haven't seen this yet. We have one observational study in which North American participants are using one device and the European participants are using a different device. Obviously, the data that are being collected, say gait, will presumably differ. Obviously, if that's the case, you'd want to have preliminary data suggesting that both devices are measuring gait in a very similar way. I think I'd be cautious here. I would use the analogy to imaging. So if you were using one set of imaging for one set of the population, another set of imaging for a different population because of usability or whatever the consideration, I think I would be a little bit concerned unless I had really good data suggesting that those two different devices, two different imaging modalities I had data prior to the study suggesting that they were indeed comparable. Linda might have additional thoughts from the FDA.
And certainly you have to determine whether the subpopulations are different in some way, right? And, is it a matter of the subpopulations being different or the devices being different? So taking the time to, tease out, where the difference really is, I think is key, and I think is a challenge. I appreciate, Ray's discussion of this topic and how he would deal with it in a real trial.
Great. Thank you. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending this Fierce Markets webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank Ray, Abby, and Linda for participating, and Citi for helping to accelerate transformation in the industry. And just as a reminder for our attendees, we have recorded this webinar, and you're going to be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that we sent to you earlier. Thank you all again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.